This video was created to provide guidance for the 5-year maintenance procedure required to be performed on the following: fuel, lubrication and cooling systems, as well as various engine-related installations. It only applies to Pipistrel sinus and virus aircraft equipped with Rotax 912 engine. Please refer to applicable AMM for information regarding the minimum mechanic qualifications required to perform the procedures this video describes, and the applicable IPC for part number guidance. Please refer any questions regarding the content of this video to maintenance@pipistrel.si.
Open the water cooler cap, insert a hose into the cooler, and use it to drain the cooling liquid into a bucket. Disconnect the hose that runs from the cooler to the overflow bottle, and empty the remaining coolant of the overflow bottle into the bucket. Drain the engine, and the oil tank, of oil, according to the procedure described in Rotax Maintenance Manual. Remove the cable ties fixing the oil tank venting pipe to the engine mount, and disconnect it from the oil tank. Remove the rubber spacers between the oil hoses, and remove the hose clamps on the oil tank fittings. Disconnect the inlet and outlet oil hoses from the oil tank. Unfasten the screws on the oil tank support holder, and remove the oil tank. Cut the cable ties supporting the oil thermostat. Remove the air filters from the carburetors by unfastening the hose clamps. And cover the carburetor air inlets with protective plastic caps. Disconnect fuel feed lines from the left and right carburetors by releasing the hose clamps. Use protective plastic caps to close the inlet fittings on the carburetors. Direct the hoses into a bucket to collect any fuel leakage. Cut the throttle and choke control cables on the control levers on the carburetors. And cut the cables just before the splitter fitting on the plate at the top of the engine. Slide off the portion of the control cables between the splitters and the carburetors. Remove the heat shrink tube pieces holding the bowdens attached to the carburetors, and disconnect them at both ends. Release the carburetor retaining clamps and springs, and attach the carburetors from the engine. Disconnect the propeller pitch control cable from the control arm on the engine, removing the connection bolt. And remove the bowden support from the port intake manifold. Cooling system, water cooler removal. Release the hose clamps securing the inlet and outlet hoses to the cooler, then disconnect and remove the hoses. Close the cooler inlets and outlets with protective plastic caps. Unscrew the two bolts on top, and the two below the cooler, and remove it from the engine mount. Disconnect the water temperature sensor wiring from the cooling circuit pipe. Unscrew and disconnect the grounding wires from the intake manifold. Separate the ignition system plugs from the support metal plate, and disconnect the 4 plugs. Remove the fastening material securing the ignition system to the engine. Disconnect the manifold air pressure hose, removing the hose clamp and the hose from the fitting on the compensating tube. Detach the intake manifolds, and the compensation tube between them, from the engine heads, and cover the cylinder openings with protective caps. Locate the fuel pressure sensor. If it is attached to the engine mount, disconnect the wiring and the cable ties securing the hose to the mount, and unfasten it from its support. If it is mounted on the fuel divider, unplug its electrical connector. Disconnect the fuel return line from the fuel divider. And disconnect the fuel hoses from the engine's mechanical fuel pump. Remove the protective sleeves from the fuel hoses. Disconnect the outlet feed fuel line from the gasculator. Disconnect the fuel line entering the fuel flow sensor, by releasing the hose clamp on the sensor fitting, and open the retaining clamps for the hoses on the port side of the engine. Remove the fuel divider assembly, together with the hoses connected to it. Cut the cable ties securing the spark plug cables to the cooling system hoses. Unfasten the bolts connecting the cooling system hoses outlet fittings to the cylinder heads. And remove the assembly from the engine. Using a lifter to suspend the engine, remove and replace the rubber isolators at the 4 connection points of the engine mount. Release the joints and replace the 2 upper isolators first. Then continue with the other 2. Upon reassembly, apply Loctite 243 to the treads. Torque the bolts, and apply marker paint to the nuts. Remove the map tube from the engine mount, and disconnect it from the sensor fitting on the firewall. Clean the threads of cooling system fittings and intake manifolds, using compressed air. Using a metal brush, clean the bolt threads and fittings of the cooling system hoses. Reinstall the water hoses outlet fittings on the cylinders, applying Loctite 243 to the threads. Using the old hoses as reference, cut, and replace the cooling system hoses on the top of the engine, rebuilding the complete assembly. Install the assembly on the engine, using hose clamps. Refasten the electric system cables to the cooling system hoses, using cable ties. Disconnect the compensating tube from the intake manifolds. Replace the rubber flanges and O-rings on the intake manifolds. Using the old parts as reference, replace the connection hoses on the compensating tube, and install it between the intake manifolds. Install the intake manifolds on the engine. Use Loctite 243 on the threads, and apply marker paint to the screw heads. Once the intake manifolds are in position, tighten the hose clamps on the compensating tube. Remove protective sleeves from the hoses of the fuel divider assembly. Using the old ones as reference, cut new replacement hoses at the correct length, and apply the protective sleeve on them. Install the new fuel hoses on the fuel divider using hose clamps. Reinstall the fuel divider assembly on the engine, and secure it with cable ties. Reconnect the fuel pressure sensor connector, if installed on the fuel divider, or its hose and wirings if it is installed on the engine mount. Remove the old foam baffling from the engine air intakes and from around the coolers. Unscrew the two retaining nuts, and remove the mechanical fuel pump from the engine. Remove the drain hose connected at the bottom of the pump. Remove the threaded inserts from the engine, and clean them using a metal brush. Fasten the threaded inserts on the engine, and install the new mechanical fuel pump and gasket, applying Loctite 243 to the threads. Install the new fittings on the new fuel pump, applying Loctite 577 to the threads. On the other side of the engine, connect the fuel hose to the gascolator, running it through the retaining clamp. Disconnect the hoses from the oil thermostat, releasing the hose clamps. Do the same with the hoses connected to the oil cooler. Remove the oil cooler from the engine, and replace the rubber mounts. Reinstall the oil cooler. Remove the oil filter. Then remove, clean, and reinstall the magnetic drain plug next to the oil filter. Secure it using safety wire. Install the new oil filter. Apply some oil to the gasket, before fitting it to the engine. Refasten the pitch control bowden to its support on the intake manifold. And reconnect its control cable, fastening the bolt to the control arm. Replace oil lines running from cooler to thermostat. Use the old hoses as reference to cut the new ones at correct length. Disconnect the 90 degrees oil fitting from the engine, and remove it together with the oil hose. Remove the hose from the fitting and replace it, using the insulation sleeve. Remove the protective heat shield plates on the exhaust pipes. Then unscrew the nuts fastening the exhaust headers, to allow some movement of the exhaust pipes. Disconnect and remove the retaining springs, securing the muffler to the Y collector, using a spring removal hook. Unfasten and remove the muffler support bracket from the bottom of the engine. While holding the muffler by the tailpipe, detach the Y collector pipes from the muffler, and remove the muffler. Disconnect the 4 liquid coolant hoses from the cylinders, releasing the hose clamps. Drain the coolant into a bucket. Remove the coolant hoses going from the water pump fittings to the cylinders. If necessary, also remove the lower engine block mounts, to make accessing the fittings on the water pump easier. Clean the hose fittings on the water pump, and on the cylinders, using a cloth and benzene. Using the old hoses as a reference, cut and prepare the new coolant hoses. Install the new coolant hoses, from the water pump to aft cylinders. Secure the hoses using new hose clamps. Refasten the temperature sensor wires to the coolant hose using cable ties. After installing the short coolant hose from the pump to the rear cylinder, reinstall the lower engine block mount. In order to make the positioning of the mounts easier, tilt the engine slightly using straps around the propeller flange, and lift it using a workshop lifter. Use Loctite 243 on M8 nuts, and M10 bolt threads. Torque the M10 bolts on the engine block to 40 Nm. Install the new coolant hose, running from the water pump to the front cylinder. Apply the insulation sleeve, and connect it to the fittings using 2 hose clamps. With the same procedure, replace the coolant hoses on the other side of the engine. Apply marker paint to nuts, and hose clamp screws. Release the hose clamp, and remove the corrugated water coolant return hose. Replace it with a new part, securing it to the water pump with a new hose clamp. Remove the oil return line, running from the engine to the oil tank, by releasing the hose clamps on the engine bottom fitting. Direct any excess oil into a bucket. Using the old hose as reference, cut, and prepare the new oil hose. Insert the hose into the insulation sleeve, and fix it to the hose, using a piece of heat shrink tube. Connect the oil hose to the fitting at the bottom of the engine, using a hose clamp. And apply marker paint to the hose clamp screw. Run the oil hose in between the exhaust and the cylinders on the starboard side of the engine, and secure it to the engine using cable ties. Prepare the new oil hose between the oil cooler and the oil pump. Cut a new hose at the right length, apply the insulation sleeve, and fix the 90 degrees elbow metal fitting to one end, using a hose clamp. Run the oil hose over the exhaust pipes on the starboard side of the engine. Connect the 90 degrees elbow fitting to the oil pump, and tighten the hose clamp to the hose. Fasten the two oil hoses to the engine, and together, using cable ties and pieces of hose as spacers. Use cable ties to secure the EGT sensor cable to oil and coolant hoses. Use Allen key 4 to unlock and open the clamp on the tank retaining ring. Remove the ring, and open the tank. Then remove the internal strainer, the gasket, the oil drain screw at the bottom, and other internal components. Clean all the parts with benzene. When reassembling the oil tank, replace the copper washer of the drain screw at the bottom of the tank, and secure it with safety wire. Cut the cable ties holding the feed and return fuel lines together, near the exit point on the firewall. Enter the cabin, and disconnect the fuel lines from the joint right after the fuel valve, in the wing roots area. Blow compressed air into the lines to purge them of fuel residuals, and prevent dripping inside the cabin during the line's replacement. Access the baggage compartment, and locate the feed and return lines running behind the bulkhead along the fuselage sides, and into the channel below the cabin. Cut the fitting at the end of the fuel return line. And remove the lines, pulling the hoses through the passage hole on the cabin bulkhead, and through the tube holders in the baggage compartment, along the bulkhead sides. Release the hose clamp holding the fuel lines attached to the firewall, by unfastening the screw fixed to the battery support. Access the area below the cabin through the stick drive opening, and cut the cable ties along the fuel lines holding the hoses attached to the fuselage floor. Release the hose clamp on the gasculator, and unplug the feed fuel line from the fitting. Remove the insulation sleeve. Cut the feed line just before the T-fitting flow splitter. Once the fastening material has been removed, enter the cabin and remove the fuel lines, pulling them out from the baggage compartment. Remove the fittings from the old fuel feed lines. They will be used again on the new fuel feed hoses. Remove the old hoses connected to the fuel drain valve and gasculator. Locate the new fuel lines in the kit, and start the installation procedure on the aircraft. Install the new fuel return line. Insert the hose end without the fitting from the left wing root, through the cabin bulkhead hole, and through the hose braces along the fuselage walls, and then into the passage below the cabin. Grab the hose from the stick drive hatch and pull it into the cabin. Insert a probe into the insulation sleeve of the longer of the two hoses, from the firewall side. Grab it from the cabin side, insert the end of the probe into the new fuel return hose, and connect the two parts using adhesive tape. Then pass the fuel hose through the firewall into the insulation sleeve, pulling by the probe. Remove the probe when finished. If the aircraft is equipped with pass-through fittings on the firewall, remove the fitting flange from the firewall by unfastening the two screws, and disconnect the old lines from the fittings. Then, connect the probe to one of the lines first, and remove it by pulling from the baggage compartment. Once the old fuel line is removed, connect the new one to the probe, pull it out from the firewall, and reconnect it to the fitting. Repeat the procedure with the other fuel line, and finally refasten the pass-through fitting assembly to the firewall. Grab the new feed fuel lines from the kit. Access the baggage compartment from the cabin, and insert the fuel line downstream the T-joint through the passage below the cabin. Grab the hose from the stick drive hatch, and pull out it into the cabin. Run the two fuel feed lines up through the tube holders on each side of the fuselage. Pass the lines through the bulkhead, reaching the wing roots. Use the probe to pull the fuel feed line out of the firewall. Repeat the procedure performed before, for the return line, this time inserting the probe into the shorter insulation sleeve. When both the new feed and return fuel lines are in position below the cabin floor, fasten the hoses to the fuselage using cable ties. Use the new T-splitter fuel hose assembly from the kit. Remove one segment, if the part is installed in an airplane not equipped with firewall pass-through fuel fitting. Adapt the length of the hoses using the old part as reference. Apply the insulation sleeve removed before, and connect one end of the T-splitter to the fuel drain fitting, using a cable tie. Fasten the return fuel line to the firewall with the hose clamp. Fasten the feed and return fuel lines together using cable ties. And adapt the length of the feed line, for the connection to the T-shaped fitting, attached to the gascolator and fuel drain valve. Secure the joints using cable ties. Adapt the length of the other T-splitter hose section, to be connected to the gascolator fitting. Apply the insulation sleeve, and, using a heat gun, fix a piece of heat shrink tube at the end of it. Connect the T-splitter hose to the gascolator, using a hose clamp. Move into the cabin near the wing roots, cut the fuel feed hoses at the correct length, and install the fittings at the end of the hoses. Secure the hoses to the joint fittings with 3 cable ties, be sure to avoid any hose kinking or sharp radii. Reinstall the plastic placards with the open-closed fuel valve indication. Reconnect the fuel feed line to the fuel valve fitting. Open the gascolator by removing its 4 screws. Remove the gascolator filter and perform visual check inside the gascolator cup. Clean the gascolator cup and spring, using benzene and compressed air. And replace the gascolator filter. Close the gasculator. The gasket is to be replaced on condition. Reconnect ignition system plugs, by matching the numbers marked on the plugs. Reinstall the coolant temperature sensor connector. Connect the grounding wire to the intake manifold. And fasten the electric cables together, and to the engine mount with cable ties. Reinstall the exhaust muffler, fixing it to the pipes with retaining springs. And connect the muffler to the engine with the support bracket after replacing the gasket. Torque the screw to 11 Newton meters. Fasten the exhaust headers to the cylinders. Reinstall the protective heat shield plates on the exhaust headers. Reinstall the carburetors. Enter the cabin, and cut cable ties securing the engine control buttons to the back of the central pedestal. Disconnect the choke control cable from the choke lever, and remove the wire, pulling it from the cabin side. Do the same with the choke button, reaching it below the cabin through the control stick drive hatch. Insert the new choke button through the hole in the cabin floor, behind the panel central pedestal. The button end with the bigger fitting is on the cabin side. Shove the other end of the choke button through the port side of the hole on the firewall, located above the battery. Pull the choke button end out of the firewall, from the engine side, and insert it into the fitting on the support plate on top of the engine. On the cabin side, shove the choke bowden below the cabin floor, through the stick drive opening, and run the bowden in through the hole below the choke control lever. Insert it in the housing on the choke control lever assembly. Position the engine control bowdens behind the panel central pedestal, in a way that the choke bowden enters the opening on the floor on the port side, and the throttle bowden on the starboard side, and fix the bowden to the pedestal using cable ties. Remove, and replace the throttle control wire, and bowden, in a similar fashion. Pass the bowden through the starboard hole on the firewall, and the starboard side of the opening on the cabin floor behind the panel central pedestal. Screw the throttle bowden into the fitting at the bottom of the throttle lever assembly. Disassemble the throttle lever assembly by unscrewing the nut, and remove the control lever. Check if the throttle control cable fits properly into the throttle lever housing, adapt its shape if not. Insert the throttle control cable into the hole at the base of the throttle lever, and then into the bowden in the throttle assembly. Pull the cable from the engine side, and remount the throttle lever assembly. Apply Loctite 243 to the lever's threaded axle. Adjust lever friction by tightening the nut. Prepare the choke control cable by fixing the fitting at one end. Secure the connection of the fitting to the wire, by soldering it into the fitting hole. Insert the choke control wire into the bowden, and connect the terminal fitting to the choke lever. Position the new throttle control bowden end into the housing above the carburetor throttle arm, and run the control wire through the hole of the lever fitting. Crimp a metal sleeve to the end of the control wire. Fix the control wire to the throttle arm fitting. Position the bowden end. And slide a heat shrink tube onto the bowden. Repeat the operation on the other side of the engine. Slide another piece of heat shrink tube onto each throttle control cable, and position the end of the bowdens into the fittings on the plate on top of the engine. Tension the cables, and cut them 5 cm from the end of the bowden. Insert the throttle control cable ends into the splitter joint and secure them with the screw. The cables must not protrude into the joint hole. Position the choke control bowden on the carburetor, and screw the end fitting onto the very end of the control cable. Insert the end fitting into the housing on the choke control arm on the carburetor, and tension the cable. Slide 2 pieces of heat shrink tube onto each choke bowden, and position the bowden ends into the fittings on the plate above the engine. Repeat the operation on the other side of the engine. Tension the choke control cables, and cut them 5 cm from the end of the bowden. Insert the choke control cable ends into the splitter joint, and secure them with the screw. The cables must not protrude into the joint hole. This operation is similar to the one performed for the throttle control cables. Solder the cables to the splitters. Set the idle adjustment screw on both carburetors, using a 0.1 mm spacer, and then turn 3/4 of a full revolution in the clockwise direction. Tension the engine control cables, and put the throttle lever in idle position, and the choke control lever in full forward position. Apply tension to the cables, by pulling them from the cabin side, and run them close to the splitter joint over the engine. Mark the point where the engine control cables, coming from the cabin, match the center of the holes on the splitter joints. Cut the engine control cables coming from the cabin at the marked position. Apply soldering paste, and soldering tin, to the end of the engine control cables. Install the fittings on the engine control cable ends. The cable ends must not protrude out of the fittings. Secure the joint between cables and end fittings by applying soldering paste and tin into the fitting holes. Use a file to make the surface of the fitting smooth. Insert the control cable's fittings into the splitters. Check again the tension of the engine control cables, and the position of the idle speed adjustment screws. If necessary, adjust the cable tension, by adjusting the nuts on carburetors, and on the support plate, on top of the engine. Check for the simultaneous, and uniform, travel of the engine controls on both carburetors. Fix and stabilize the engine control buttons to the engine, using cable ties and spacers, made of pieces of rubber hose. Using a heat gun, fix the heat shrink tubes to the engine control button ends. Replace the fuel hose section, downstream from the fuel flow sensor, removing the insulation sleeve piece, and the hose clamp from the sensor fitting. Use the old piece of hose as reference for cutting the new one. Connect the fuel flow sensor to the inlet and outlet fuel lines. Insert the insulation sleeve, and use hose clamps to secure the hoses to the flow sensor fittings. Connect the fuel feed hoses to the fitting of the left and right carburetor, using hose clamps. Fasten the fuel hoses to the port side of the engine by tightening the hose clamps on the support brace. Fasten the fuel flow cable to the engine mount, using cable ties. Prepare the fuel return line to be connected to the fuel divider fitting. Adjust the hose length if necessary. Fix a piece of heat shrink tube to the insulation sleeve end, and secure it to the fuel divider, using a hose clamp. Prepare the water cooler for the installation by removing the protective caps from the hose fittings and mounting the outlet coolant hose. Fasten it to the cooler with a hose clamp. Reinstall the water cooler by fastening it to its mount, using the 4 bolts. Apply Loctite 243 to the bolt threads. Fasten the return hose to the cooler, using 2 hose clamps. Apply marker paint to the bolts. Adjust the length of the coolant hose that goes to the water pump, and fasten it to the cooler fitting with a hose clamp. Remove the old tube connecting the cooler to the overflow bottle, and replace it with the new one, cut at the right length. Use a hose clamp on the overflow bottle, and cable tie on the cooler fitting. Refill the cooling system from the cooler cap, with a mix of 50% of coolant and 50% of water, and then add coolant to the overflow bottle, until the level is within the prescribed limits. Reinstall the oil tank, by fastening it to its brace, with the 2 bolts. Apply Loctite 243 to the bolt threads, and torque mark them. Close the oil tank cover clamp. Remove the protective caps from the oil tank fittings. Cut the inlet hose to the right length, and connect it to the oil tank, using a hose clamp. Using cable ties and rubber hose spacers, secure the oil thermostat to the starboard intake manifold. Cut the oil hoses to the right length, and connect them to the thermostat valve using hose clamps. Stabilize the hoses by fastening them with cable ties and spacers to other engine installations. Remove the protective cap from the oil tank outlet fitting. Cut the hose at the right length, and connect it to the oil tank outlet fitting using a hose clamp. Fix the oil breather hose to the tank fitting, using a cable tie. Run it behind the oil tank, and down to the lower part of the firewall. Cut a breather hole on the tube, few centimeters under the firewall lip, and cut the tube few centimeters below this point. Secure the tube to the engine mount with cable ties. Refill the oil system according to the procedure prescribed in the Rotex line maintenance manual. Connect the new excess fuel hose on the fuel pump. Fasten it to the pump fitting, using a cable tie, and create an indent on the hose few centimeters before the end. Replace the air inlet baffling on the engine cowlings and around the coolers.